So welcome again. If you didn't hear what I said before, just wait for questions at the end. We'll use the raise hand function. And I am just going to introduce our speaker tonight. Heidi Dollard is the co-chair of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network's steering committee. She works to educate gardeners and homeowners on how they can support pollinators and other beneficial wildlife while creating a beautiful and low maintenance landscape. She has a master's in biology and is a master gardener. She has been an enthusiastic native plant gardener for many years, and we really appreciate you giving this talk tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Heidi.
Thank you. And thank you for all the assistance and tech support from the town of Great Barrington. So I'm going to get started. I will very briefly talk about why this is so important. I think the people in Great Barrington are pretty aware of the current crisis that we're facing in biodiversity, that there's a huge loss or the threat of loss of a lot of species, particularly insects. And insects are vital to life on Earth. They're vital to our ecology. They're vital to our agriculture. There's a famous entomologist, E.O. Wilson, who thinks that if the insects on Earth were to disappear, then humans would only be able to survive for a very few months after that. And so this is a very serious situation. Fortunately, it's something we can do a lot about, that we as individuals, particularly people who have control over some plot of land, be it a yard or an entryway or even a few flower pots, can make a difference. So that is what I'm going to talk about, what you can do in your own sphere of influence. Step one, and I'm going through, I kind of facetiously call this a 12-step program because it is as if we are recovering from a very bad habit or an addiction. First thing is to stop using pesticides, herbicides, and artificial fertilizer as much as possible. There are a few situations where you really must use it, like if you have a wasp's nest over your front door, although, if it is possible to get rid of it without any herbicides, but to just do your best to use next to none or none. All of these things are very harmful to the environment in one way or the other. As of obviously, pesticides kill insects. That's what they're designed to do. And many of the ones that are available to homeowners and landscapers are incredibly powerful. The worst one is the class of pesticides called neonicotinoids. These are pesticides that are put into the soil. They are particularly used a lot by people who grow plants in greenhouses, which means that if you buy a pot of a potted plant that was started in a greenhouse, unless you specifically are assured by the person selling it or the person who raised it that there was no neonics, there's good chance that it was. So that is probably the most important thing to check, to make sure that you do not bring any of those or any additional neonics onto your property or into your yard. They are, I guess that they started being used a lot in the 1990s. And at first they were considered sort of a miracle chemical because previous chemical pesticides were very dangerous to people and were very harmful to, humans. Turns out neonics are much safer here for humans, but way, way worse for insects. For a lot of reasons, the main one being is that they persist in the soil. They do not break down as other chemicals do. Not only do they persist in the soil, but they are systemic. So they are taken up by plants through the roots. They're all through the plant, in the leaves, in the nectar, in the pollen, in the seeds. So once they're in that environment, insects cannot avoid them. They're any insects that takes a bite of a leaf, a sip of nectar, or carries pollen off to their nest is going to be transmitting that poison. Some of these, low levels may not kill an insect outright, but they will have what we call sublethal effects. So it may prevent a bee from navigating, or it may prevent a beetle from being able to fly properly. So all these things may not result in like dead bees lying around the yard, but it will prevent them from successfully completing their life cycles and reproducing. And so this is one of the things that is causing a huge reduction that we're seeing in insects across the planet. And it's everywhere. It's everywhere anyone has checked on planet Earth. There is a huge die-off of insects. So no pesticides as much as possible. They harm, besides the direct effects to insects, they harm birds, mammals, and microbial life. Even fertilizers can be extremely harmful to the environment. As you know, you've probably read about the runoff of excess nitrogen and phosphorus causing huge dead zones in parts of the ocean and in the Gulf of Mexico. We really just do not need these in the environment. So this is step one. Go chemical free as much as possible. Step two, lighting outside. This is really easy and will cost you next to no money. If possible, just leave the outside lights off. Why is this a problem? The insects are very light sensitive. A lot of them are attracted to light. Those of us of a certain age remember under our porch lights, there would be a pile of dead insects. That doesn't happen so much anymore because there's fewer insects. But we don't want to be killing insects inadvertently with the porch lights, or spotlights, or whatever other lights you may have, decorative lights around your patio. If you must have outside lights, make sure that they're pointing down, or that they're yellow. Apparently the yellow lights are not as attractive to insects. So all these lights are not just bad for insects, they're terrible for birds. They throw off bird navigation. They confuse a lot of other animals. And in fact, there's evidence that these night lights are not good for humans either. So, as I say, use yellow LEDs, point your lights down if you must have them, and or get motion activated fixtures so that they only go on when you're walking outside or someone's walking up to your front door. Otherwise, dark. Step 3. Okay, now we're getting into the gardening part of the program. So the first step is to really understand what you've got in your yard. And this is really, really important. Probably the primary thing is to understand where you have sun, where you have shade. It changes over the course of the day, changes over the course of a season. So you may need to go out and make maps and diagrams. I think there's also some online software that you can use to do this. but it's really good to understand exactly what you have. It's good to take pH, do soil tests. You can bring soil tests to the cooperative extension. Oftentimes, the master gardeners have soil testing sites at farmers markets and stuff. So you want to understand what your planting conditions are before you go out and buy more plants. You also want to see what plants you already have. Some of the plants you already have may be great. Some of them may be a terrible problem. Some of them may just be a waste of space. So if you can do a survey of your yard, particularly the large and numerous plants, or if you have some just unloved non-native plants, in particular, my case in point is forsythia. There are so many old, overgrown, ratty forsythias out there that are now, in a shady location. They don't even bloom, and they're just a waste of space. And they grow big, and so they grow more. They waste more and more space. If you love your forsythia, fine, but that's just an example of a plant that may not be really earning the space in your yard. It's also good to know if you have valuable native plants. You may have some great useful plants. One in particular, a lot of trees, oaks in particular, are one of the most valuable plants. And so if you just take an inventory, in a minute, I'll give you some ideas about how to identify your plants, but also think about yourself. How much time and energy do you have for a yard project? And you should be adjusting your plans and expectations accordingly. Do not take on more than you can handle, or it just will become a burden and possibly just a mess. So you can use smartphone apps to help you ID plants. My top one that I use all the time is iNaturalist. It's free. It's very easy to use. You can follow the instructions. The same people put out one called Seek, which is a little easier to use. Sometimes they all use this, these two use the same underlying database. I really like iNaturalist because if you post your photo, then some expert will come by a couple days later and confirm or correct your identification. So you get that, you're told whether you're right or wrong. Sometimes iNaturalist does not work that great though. So what I do, unless I'm really convinced that it's correct, is I will take its top recommendation and then I will Google it to make sure that other pictures on the internet really match what I have in front of me. And I read the description. I also sometimes use books, particularly for trees. But I think it's important to not just rely on the apps, to look at other sources as well. And as you do this enough, you'll be able to identify a lot of plants. It's very, very helpful, very useful. And I think it really, to be knowledgeable about the plants around us, really enriches your experience when you're out walking or you're out in the woods. And, it's like you recognize old friends. Okay, invasive plants. I could talk the whole hour about invasive plants. These are a huge, huge problem, and they're getting to be a bigger problem every year. Invasive plants, the definition of invasive plants are non-native plants, plants that came from another part of the world, many of them from Asia, Europe, that have brought to this country either intentionally as for decoration, or accidentally they came over in the stomach of a cow, or they came over in ship ballast. But once they got here, they were freed from whatever ecological constraints, whatever predators or diseases they had in their home country. And they've got literally, they're taking over the landscape. The one that I find the scariest is bittersweet, but there's also multiflora rose, there's tree of heaven, a lot of just low growing herbaceous ones like bishop's goutweed. It's you will find, unless you have some little piece of untouched heaven on earth, I can guarantee you will find some invasive plants on your property. And it's really important for you to remove them effectively and appropriately. And you certainly, well, you don't want to start a new planting project and have your new plants competing with these invasives. Now you may think, oh, but I love my tree of heaven. I'm going to keep my tree of heaven. Well, it's not really just you who are affecting. You may make a promise to yourself that you'll remove any seedlings, but those seedlings are going over into other people's yards, into conservation areas, parks, wilderness areas. So it's really irresponsible not to be managing the invasives on your property as much as possible. If you have a large property, it may be more than you can really handle. And I hear that. So if you at least can keep the plants that you have from reproducing, so if you have bittersweet, at least cut the vines before they set seeds. Same thing of multiflora rose. I could go on and on, but the best thing to do is to get a good guide. I don't know if it's, but the Maine government has an excellent guide. You can buy a hard copy, or you can just go to this website and you can either read or print out a PDF. Do I need more light here? I think I'm losing the light. You can see me a little better. So Maine doesn't include all of our invasive plants. Let me just back up 1 minute. There are two lists that the state of Massachusetts maintains. One is a list of invasive plants. The other one is a list of prohibited plants. They're not quite exactly the same. The prohibited plants are not supposed to be sold. They're supposed to be illegal to sell. And I just saw in the Hampshire Gazette that the Callery pear or Bradford pear is going to be on the prohibited list, which is excellent news because those things seed like crazy and they can easily take over a field if they are not kept in check. They're very popular as a street tree. I see them everywhere in the spring. And when I drive to visit my daughter in North Carolina, I see hundreds and hundreds of fields just filled with this one species. The other thing about these invasives is that they are not part of our ecology. They don't feed most insects do not touch them. Many deer will not eat them. I know you're surprised to hear that because the deer probably eat a lot of your garden plants like your hosta. They do not eat the multiflora rose or the bittersweet. Those I have pulled out bushels and bushels and bushels of bittersweet, and I have never seen a single insect hole or a bite ever taken out of one of its leaves. These things are just like completely inedible to any of our local animals or insects. So it's not fun. It's a pain in the neck, but they are becoming more and more prevalent in the environment. And I think it's one of the scariest things. And it's one of the things that is one of the main reasons why we're seeing insect decline. So I really can't underemphasize the importance of this. So there's, again, the guidebook. So next step, now that you've cleaned up your yard, you understand what plants you have, you've gotten rid of the bad ones, sit down and really analyze the data that you've collected. First thing first, does your property need any hardscaping or regrading, any major work to the ground, to the contours, putting in a new driveway, putting in a new patio? Do you have problems with drainage? Anything like that should be addressed first, because that will be a major disruption to your landscape. And you want to do that. You don't want to lose any new plants that you planted. So that would be that's the first thing to get out of the way. The next question is, where are my areas of opportunity? So I'll talk more about that, but where can I put new plants? What can I get rid of that is not useful? I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but the main area of opportunity for almost everybody is their lawn. Lawns, I am sad to say, because people just love lawns, is that it's a wasteland. It's dead space. It's ecologically a dead zone. It supports almost nothing, really. And it's, if you have kids, if you have dogs, yeah, you need lawn. Also, lawn is great for walking on, so it's a good thing for paths. But if you are not walking on it and you're not playing football or soccer on your lawn, then you should think about what you could be doing with that lawn space to add to the ecology and have it feeding insects and other wildlife. So the lawn should be where you're walking. So paths, not great expanses of grass. The other question is simply, where can I be adding native plants and bushes? The reason I say plants and bushes is because they provide a lot of biomass. That's a lot of leaves that a lot of insects and wildlife can eat. It's a lot more leaves than, say, a coneflower could. So that's why one of the reasons I recommend native plants and bushes. The other reason is they are very much easier to maintain. And, unless you're a crazy dedicated gardener, you probably want low maintenance solutions. And plants and bushes are, once they get going, they really need very, very little from the homeowner. Maybe you want to prune them once a year, but once they're established, you don't need to water them. Especially if you got the right plant in the right place, they are very self-sufficient. So areas of opportunity, let's go into more detail about that. Unused lawn, areas under trees in particular is probably the best place to establish a new garden area if that's what you'd like to do. Why under trees? It's because leaves harbor many, many, many valuable insects, and they overwinter in dead leaves. So what you want to be able to do is let the leaves fall right underneath the tree and let them be. Do not blow them, do not rake them. And if you have appropriate plantings under that tree, it's just mulch. The plants under the tree will be happy to have another layer of mulch as the leaves fall. and you will be happy not to rake them or blow them. And all the insects in the leaves will be very happy to have a place to spend the winter. Unfortunately, if you blow the leaves, and certainly if you chop the leaves, you've killed all those insects. And so all the great feeding and sheltering that your tree did is all for naught if all the insects are killed in the fall by your removal or chopping of the leaves. Also, it's good for the tree. Trees put a lot of energy into creating those leaves. And then when they fall, that's nutrients that could be going back into that tree as the leaves rot and those nutrients are available to the roots. Then they cycle back up into the tree. If you take away the leaves, you're taking away tree food. So it's just a win-win-win for everybody if you can establish a garden area underneath trees. Ideally, if you take the tip, this is a tree, this is a branch, right underneath that most outermost branch is what we call the drip line. So if you can establish a garden right under the drip line of a tree, you'll be doing everybody a big favor. So that's why I say under trees is a prime area of opportunity. You know, if you have slopes that are hard to mow, you're not walking on it. No kids are playing on it. You're not playing soccer on it. That would be a good place to do a bank of shrubs, for example. And then, of course, if you have existing flower beds, it's always great to just be adding native flowers to existing flower gardens. So that's another easy thing. And as I said, lawn is the biggest opportunity. This is just an ecological desert. This is, you know, probably this homeowner either spends hours riding around on the lawnmower, or they spend hundreds of dollars paying somebody else to do it. And what good is this lawn doing to anybody? So again, here's a picture of a lawn with existing trees, very healthy trees. And so this homeowner could just add some underplantings under these trees and greatly increase the ecological value of their property, even if they didn't want to eliminate all the lawn. So here are some design guidelines. Now, of course, I can't say this enough, right plant, right place. This is why you did all that investigation into understanding your property. You don't want to plant a wetland plant in a dry meadow. You don't want to plant a plant that does best in a dry meadow in a wet place. It's just a waste of time and money. I mean, every once in a while, you'll plant a plant that shouldn't be happy where it is, and yet it is. But that's not the way things usually go. Usually, if you aren't careful enough to match the plant with its preferred habitat, it's not going to make it. It's not going to be happy, and it's going to die. Probably a sad, withering death. So make sure that you're putting the right plant in the right place. The rule of thumb, this was a famous study done by a student of Doug Tallamy named Desiree Narango, who, by the way, is now at UMass. She did a very famous study where this was in a suburb of Washington, D.C., where she went out into a suburban landscape and she analyzed different areas based on what percentage of the biomass was native versus non-native. And her goal was to correlate the percentage of native plants with the success of breeding birds. She was looking at the Carolina chickadee. And what she found was that if the percentage of plant biomass fell below 70%, Carolina chickadees could not reproduce. Either they just didn't bother laying any eggs, or if they did lay eggs, the chicks did not survive. The chicks died of starvation. Why is this? It's because baby birds need caterpillars. Except in a very few species, no baby birds can eat birdseed. They can't eat berries. They must have insects, particularly caterpillars. Caterpillars eat native plants. They don't eat non-native plants. Yeah, every once in a while you'll see some caterpillars on non-native plants. But if you did a careful survey, as Doug Tallamy has done, you would see almost no caterpillars on non-native plants. You would see hundreds of thousands of caterpillars on native plants. And in fact, what Desiree found was that pair of Carolina chickadees needed between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest, probably 3 chicks. It's a lot of caterpillars. And that's why we need all that native plant biomass. So that's why the 70% is the magic number. Now, yes, it was just one experiment, and maybe it's different for different species, but I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. I definitely would not want to fall below 70% native biomass. And again, if you plant a lot of trees and bushes, you're going to have a lot of native biomass. So that's very important. The next issue is that you want to plant straight species and not cultivars. What do I mean by straight species? I mean a species, a plant that is as it is out in the wild, unmessed with by people or plant breeders. A cultivar is a variety of plant that was either selected for, it could have been, like a color variant that somebody found, or a lot of plant breeders will cross plants with other, closely related species, or in other ways try to get a lot of variation and then choose just the fanciest plants. So, when you open up your Fine Gardening magazine and you see all the, plants of the year or plants to look out for, 99% of the time, those are plants that were bred to be especially beautiful and appealing to humans. And there's a good chance that in that process, they've lost what is beneficial and appealing to insects. So you want to stick with straight species. The species, as it exists out in the wild, they are available commercially, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But those are the plants that have evolved over millennium to be beneficial to insects. Sometimes the cultivars have been bred in such a way that they don't even have pollen. Not good for pollinators if there's no pollen. Sometimes there is still nectar, but the way the petals are all, double and frilly, insects can't get at the nectar. All of that makes them much less useful or totally useless. Now there is a researcher at the University of Vermont named Annie White who really wanted to look at whether cultivars were useful to insects, and she looked at 25 species of plants that are common in the trade, and she found that about 20% of them were as good, or in some cases even better, than the straight species. So some cultivars are fine. Problem is, you don't know what they are. Nobody knows what they are unless they repeat Annie White's experiments. And even if you looked up the cultivars that Annie White used, you probably can't find them because every year they come out with new and better cultivars. So it would be really impossible to know which ones are okay and which ones are not okay. I will say this about cultivars. We do know that cultivars that change the color of the foliage are almost always not as palatable to caterpillars. So, for example, there's a very popular variety of nine bark. It's a very pretty shrub. The straight species has green leaves, but there's a few cultivars of this nine bark. I think one's called like Diablo or something that has, well, in fact, I planted it before I knew this. The changes in the leaf chemicals seem to make the leaves less palatable or maybe not edible at all to insects. So avoid any cultivar that changes the color of the leaves. I think, and people in the know have confirmed this, that cultivars that just change the plant's habit. So in other words, they make it smaller, or they, instead of being upright, it's creeping or weeping or shorter or something like that, or sturdier, ones that aren't less likely to flop. Those are probably okay as cultivars. So for example, there are varieties of little blue stem, which is a lovely native grass, that are bred to be less floppy than the straight species. I would guess those are okay. I don't know that. There's been no scientific study done of that, but other people have agreed with me in that assumption or that guess. So that's why it's really good to stick with straight species. If you really want some of those, there's all those crazy colors of cone flowers out there. You can have them, just count them as part of your 30% rather than as part of your 70%. If you're trying to really make your property support Carolina chickadees, for example. Okay, next design guideline. You want to include host plants. What do I mean by a host plant? Host plant is a plant that harbors and feeds mostly earlier life stages, like a caterpillar or a different kind of newly hatched insect. Some insects don't start out as caterpillars; they just start out as a smaller insect, and then they go through a number of, they're called instar stages. But a host plant provides both shelter and food to these young early life stages. Perfect example is milkweed is a host plant to the monarch caterpillars. Monarch caterpillars can only eat plants in the milkweed genus. There's probably 4 or 5 different species of milkweed that are local and native that they will lay their eggs on, and those eggs will hatch, and the caterpillars can eat the leaves, and they will grow to adulthood if a bird doesn't eat them first. So that's a perfect example of a host plant. Some insects are very, very specific, like the monarch. Some are much more generic. Oak trees are the best for providing that kind of food to young insects. Oak trees, I think white oaks in particular, can support over 400 species of insects. So if you have room for an oak and a right place for an oak, that's a particularly good one to plant. So so a lot of people, when they think, oh, pollinator garden, I'm going to plant flowers because I'm going to provide pollen and nectar, which is great, but that's what the adults are feeding on. Well, baby young bees eat the pollen because the adults bring them the pollen. But that's where you see the adult insects. But you have to be thinking about the whole life cycle. That's why you want to think about, where are the insects going to spend the winter? Where are the eggs going to be laid? Where are they going to have a place for the eggs to be laid, and the caterpillars, when they hatch, will they have something to eat? You need to think about the entire life cycle, not just, oh, I planted a butterfly bush because I want to see butterflies. Well, you won't see butterflies unless you plant the host plants for the butterfly caterpillars. So, for example, I have tons of fritillary butterflies in my yard because the host plant for the fritillaries is violets. And I have a lot of violets in my yard. And I think that's the reason. That's the most common butterfly I see in my yard. So that's an example of why it's important to think about host plants and feeding the early life stages. Next thing is, the insects need something to eat from the minute they wake up in the spring to when they do whatever they're going to do for the winter. Either they're going to, a lot of them go through the winter as wrapped up in a cocoon, or they just bury into the soil or whatever. But from the minute they're active to the minute they're inactive in the fall, you need to be providing food for all of them, including the adults. So you want a variety of flower shapes and colors, and you ideally want at least one thing, preferably a bunch of things, blooming from early spring right until things are really dead for the winter. Now, if you don't have a big property, you can't do everything. So, don't stress about it. But the more space you have, the more space that you can do. And this is a good goal. Ideally, you want multiple levels, a ground level where there's herbaceous plants, a mid-level where there's shrubs, and then a high level, the top canopy level where there's trees. You don't need giant trees. You can have small, beautiful native trees, but those multiple layers provide a lot more habitat and a lot more food. If possible, if you have space, it's really good to plant in big suites. So instead of planting like a group of 3, if possible, plant a group of 5 or a group of 10 or even a group of 15. Why is that important? Because when bees are foraging, they hone in usually on one flower type or even one species. And they want to just go a short distance from flower to flower to flower. And if they can get all of they need with very short trips, they're spending a lot less energy in their grocery shopping, basically. They get all the pollen they need, they can bring it back, or she, because it's always the females who do all the pollen collecting. They can bring it back to their nests very efficiently. They spend less energy, they're more likely to be able to reproduce successfully. So the big sweeps are important for insects, but it's also just a good design principle from the point of view of an attractive planting. One reason is a lot of the flowers and colors of native plants are not as bright and showy, not as big as they are in, cultivated plants, which is what our eyes are kind of accustomed to. And by putting a lot of these plants together, you really magnify their textures, you magnify their colors. So it's more pleasing to humans also. Plus, another thing about native plants is a lot of them are, they're not a great shape compared to, these great cultivars, which are bred to be like a very nice mounding shape. A lot of them are sort of, a lot of stalk and then just flowers on top. And the bottom of the plant is not that attractive. The more of them you can cluster together, the more you'll have like a beautiful spread of flowers for your eye to follow, and you won't be seeing as much of the lower kind of leggy part of the plant. Another good design guideline is to be sort of more civilized and more formal, close to the house, close to your entrances, close to your patio. And, that's where, I personally put, like my 30%, my peonies and, um, other favorite non-native traditional plants that, I love. And I want to have them, but I don't really want a lot of them because I really want mostly native plants. So if I put them next to the front door, they have the greatest visual impact for me as the human. And then out in the greater expanses of my yard, I try to be just 100% native and also have a wilder, less kind of carefully planned and tidy landscape. And this is not just my idea. This is a well-known design principle in landscape architecture. A super, super, super important thing to make your landscape attractive to you, to your neighbors, and to telegraph to your neighbors, this big meadow is on purpose. It's not just because I didn't get around to mowing my lawn for 3 months, is to have very sharp, well-defined edges. It could be paths, it could be stone walls, could be just mown paths, but it makes a huge, huge difference in how welcoming the landscape appears to humans. This is what the Xerces Society calls cues to care, and it's just really, really important to distinguish your yard, which is a planned and managed and intentional landscape, from this abandoned lot down the road, which is just messy, and people may think it's an eyesore. I don't think anyone can think the wildest yard is an eyesore when it has beautifully maintained paths and edges. Another thing to take into account is, what do you see from your windows? You're going to want to put a lot of beautiful flowers where you can see them. The classic one is if you have a kitchen sink under your window, and while you're doing the dishes, you want to be looking out on flowers. So if you're looking for a place to prioritize, you can't do your whole yard. You just want to start with a limited area. Think about, could I see from an important window in my house? And signage can also let your neighbors know that this is on purpose. There's a lot of places on the internet, including Healthy Yards, the Xerces Society. You can say, something that says, this is a pollinator planting. This is a good thing. And that can make all the difference too. Okay, so lots of ideas, lots of resources on the internet. Healthy Yards is a great resource for finding more resources. They have lots of links. So that's a good place to start if you're looking for information. Also, the town of Northampton has a pollinator pathway in it, and that's a whole bunch of public spaces and private yards that are linked together close enough so that foraging bees can go from one to another without having to fly, half a mile or something. And if you Google Northampton Pollinator Pathway, or if you send me an email, I will send you links to some plant recommendations. So those, it's probably similar enough to what you have in Great Barrington that those design and plant lists are probably very applicable to your yards also. Okay, so you've assessed your situation, you have thought about what would be effective, what would be useful, what you can give up. You want to develop an action plan here. So as I said, you don't need to do your whole yard at once. In fact, without a huge amount of time and probably a huge amount of money, that isn't going to happen. So you want to develop a multi-year plan. Start small under those trees, maybe somewhere that you can see from a view from your house. You want to definitely aim for low maintenance. That's where those trees and bushes come in. One thing you can do is just mow your remaining grass less, let it get higher. So instead of mowing it every week, mow it every 2 or 3 weeks. And in fact, there is a woman who, not sure she's still at UMass, her name is Susanna Lerman, and she did studies that showed, she did this actually in the suburbs of Springfield, that mowing your lawn every 2 weeks greatly increases the number of beneficial insects that can live in the lawn. Because you're not using herbicides, you're going to get little flowering plants. Hopefully you'll get violets, another little purple plant called prunella or self-heal. All these things provide food and host plants for more insects. And if you can mow them less, you will have more of them and they will flower. So that's another important thing that you can do. It's it's less effort probably than you're putting in now. So you want to come up with an action plan and start small. So once you've chosen your site, this picture shows a pretty ambitious project. If there was grass there, you have to remove the grass. Very, very, very few, if any, native plants can compete with turf grass. Turf grass makes a really tough root mat, and you're not going to be able to get anything going unless you get rid of the grass. My favorite thing is to smother with cardboard and then a layer of wood chips. If you can get enough wood chips, you can also put a very deep layer of wood chips. A lot of people recommend black plastic or clear plastic. I've tried that, and I don't think it's as effective as just the cardboard and wood chips. That's my favorite go-to method. And sometimes, they say that the clear plastic is supposed to heat up so much that it kills everything, like this kind of greenhouse effect. That has not worked for me. The black plastic does work, but not the clear plastic. You can also get machines that will mechanically remove sod, which, or you could just dig it up, that would be a lot of work. My favorite thing is to cut the grass very, very short, cover it with cardboard, cover it with wood chips. I get wood chips just from, I have I know somebody has an arbor business, and occasionally he'll bring me wood chips. And sometimes I'll just, see some tree people working in my neighborhood, and I'll say, can you just, drop me the chips that you have? And they're usually thrilled to do that because they have to pay to get rid of them. So plus they probably have to drive their truck way out of the way to pay to get rid of them. So if they're right there in your neighborhood and you have a place to dump them, they'll be thrilled to give you their wood chips. So it's handy if you have a place that you can just dump a pile of wood chips and just leave it there for a while. I think I also use wood chips for mulch, and I think it's best to kind of just let them sit for a few months or a year before I use them to mulch my perennial beds. But if you're just using them to smother grass, you can just use them straight from the truck. Do make sure, depending on what invasives, if this is a place where you had invasives, make sure that they are gone. You can still be dealing with them in a new planting, but oh, what a headache. If you have knotweed, yeah, or just do your best to make sure that that there isn't anything lurking underneath that cardboard, because it will pop up again, and it may interfere with your newly planted plants. Another piece of good news is that most natives do best in lean soil, unimproved soil. You do not need to put any soil amendments. The only exception to that is, unless your soil is way basic or way acidic, most plants are happy like around 6.5. The one plant that I often encourage people to plant that needs a different pH is blueberries. Blueberries really need something significantly more acidic. But other than that, don't don't spend a lot on compost or anything. Tell you a story. The first pollinator garden that I worked on, I didn't really know anything about native plants. And the person who was running the project insisted on buying a huge load of compost for our new pollinator garden with native plants. And I had just started to read about it. And I said, Sue, I don't think we need that compost. I don't think we should have spent all that, like $400. She was like, no, this is a garden and we're going to do it right. I was like, okay. And of course, at great expense and a huge amount of work, we moved all this compost into the garden beds. We planted all of our native plants. And of course, the plants grew huge. Not only did they grow huge, but they flopped. The native plants get very floppy when the soil is too rich, or if they're used to dry soil and they get too much water. So the garden was a mess because our soil was too rich. We should have just left the soil that we had, because it was an old barnyard, actually, was probably way too rich for the plants to begin with. And so I have a beautiful native plant meadow that is over my septic. And as you know, they put really crappy soil over septic systems. And I have a mostly little blue stem, and it does not flop at all because the soil is really, really lean. And that's often the best thing for native plants. And I don't get a lot of very aggressive plants. There's some goldenrod, but not a huge amount of goldenrod because it's too lean for the goldenrod. So don't take my advice. Do not spend money on compost. Again, the right plant in the right place. Understand what your soil and light and moisture conditions are, and just get plants that meet those conditions. Otherwise, waste of time and money. Okay, now you're ready to get plants. So we've talked about selecting plants. I gave you my spiel on neonics. If you want to support pollinators, do not get plants that have neonics in them, because it's like putting out poisoned bait. It's just so counterproductive. So how can you be sure that plants do not have neonics? I question the nursery owners very carefully. And most of them say now they try very, very hard, that they ask their suppliers and their suppliers assure them that they're not using neonics now. Andrew's greenhouse in Amherst, it's a famous place that does a lot of, does not do a lot of natives. I've spoken to them at depth several times, and they know that their customers do not want neonics. They say they do use them on some of their house plants. And I think that it is more common in house plants. So now someone gives me a house plant, a lot of these house plants are not meant to live forever. I do not put the soil in my compost. I throw it in the garbage because I think there's a good chance that they're full of neonics. Um, there's no way to be sure. There's no quick test you can do. It's a trust issue. So you must go to nurseries that you can trust. I do trust. I. Oh, the other good thing you can do is ask, ask, ask. The more you ask, the more they'll get the message that our customers do not want neonics. And I think that's coming through now. I think it is, but the most trustworthy nurseries are ones that just specialize in native plants. And there are some in our area. Specifically, I think Ward's in Great Barrington I think they want to do the right thing. I would ask them, I would continue to ask them about neonics. There's also a place called Whitney's that's way up. Is it in Chester? It's up in the northwest corner of Massachusetts. There's Checker Spot Farm in is it in Heath? Then there's Wing and a Prayer Nursery in Cummington. There's Native Plant Trust in Hatfield, and Gardener's Supply in Hadley. I believe I've talked to them a lot. I know their hearts are in the right place, that they say they do their best and that they question their suppliers. I can give you a list if you send me your email address. By growing your own plants from seed, you know for sure there's no neonics, and it's also very cost effective. So I won't go into details about winter sowing, but most native plants need a period of cold. It's called scarification. And there's some really easy ways to do this, to plant them outside in a way that's protected from critters. And depending on the species, you'll get a lot of plants. And you know that they will be straight species, they will not be cultivars, and there will be no neonics. A lot of places now sell plugs. Wing and a Prayer sells plugs. You can get them from Nasami Farm. Also, there's a great place in South Hadley called New England Wetland Plants. They have you probably need to buy a whole flat there. And again, straight species, not cultivars. If you send me your email, I will send you more resources. So install and plant these plants using the best planting practices. Dig a very wide hole, just the depth of the plant. You want the top of the plant in the pot to be even with the soil. Fluff up the roots, put it in the hole, fill up the hole with water, let it drain, fill up the hole again, halfway with soil, fill up with water, let it drain, fill the rest of the way up with soil, water again. I do often use some mycorrhizal powder, which I have on good authority can be helpful. It isn't necessary. It's an extra expense. But as you know, plants have a mycorrhizal relationship with a lot of fungus in the soil. So that can be helpful, but you do not need any other soil amendments. If you have the right match for your plant in the right place, that's all that's needed. I do have a lot of bunnies in my yard. And so sometimes I will protect a plant with mesh. It's hard to do in a large area, but you know, if you if you've spent a lot on a plant, it's worth the extra effort because you never can tell what the bunnies are going to eat. They will eat one thing in my yard, and then it will be left completely alone in a friend's yard, and vice versa. Next step, zero carbon removal. That means everything that dies in your yard stays in your yard. It doesn't go to the dump. It builds your soil. The seed heads provide food for the birds. I love to see the goldfinch on my echinacea. It's just a delight, and they feed on a lot of the other seed heads. I already mentioned you leave the leaves where they fall, if at all possible. If you could design your yard so that you just have grass paths, not big expanses of lawn, you'll have almost nothing, no fall leaves to deal with. Just the ones that are on your path, you can kind of gently sweep away with a rake. No need to blow, no need to chop. If you chop just the leaves on your paths, that's fine. If the majority of the leaves have just settled where they lay and they're creating a lovely bed for the overwintering insects. And I have to say that there's a very large aesthetic component. There's a famous garden designer, Pete Udolph, you may have heard of. He's probably the most prominent garden designer now in the world. In fact, I stole this image from one of his websites. And he believes that plant should look as beautiful dead as it did alive. And that's one of his criteria for choosing plants. And you can see in this photograph, the dead seed heads are beautiful. They're sculptural. They provide winter interest in addition to providing winter food. So you leave the leaves, the stalks, many insects, particularly a lot of our native bees, overwinter in hollow stems. So leaving them upright enables the bees to drill little holes, and then the adults stay in there, sometimes the eggs, sometimes larvae, some species will create a line of little cells. They'll lay an egg, provision it with a little bit of pollen, and then build a little wall, and then make another cell with an egg, a ball of pollen, another wall. And they need those hollow stems to do that. So just no deadheading, one less thing to do, because it's part of your beautiful sculptural winter landscape, and it's providing habitat for the overwintering bees. As I said, the seed heads are great for the birds. There's winter interest. And deadwood, standing deadwood, we're talking about a dead tree here. I know some dead trees are not in a safe location. If at all possible, if you can leave standing dead tree, it provides so much habitat for insects and food for birds. Very, very important ecologically and beautiful. Here are two examples. On the left is a very fancy backyard in Newburyport. I saw this on a garden tour. Obviously, these people have all the money in the world. They could have taken down this dead tree in the center of the photograph, but they preferred to leave it standing because it was beautiful. It's very dramatic, you know. And on the right is a garden that I saw in England this spring. They had some very bad weather. They had a terrible drought. They lost a bunch of these trees. And the head gardener, just decided to leave the dead trees where they were because it's it's sculpture, it's beautiful. And even in American art, there's this concept of the sublime as opposed to something beautiful. It's something that's sort of scary or threatening, but it invokes great emotion. And certainly these very dramatic dead trees are sublime. They I think they're very interesting visually and emotionally. Also, if you have dead branches, things that fell off, your trees or things that you cut down, it is better to let them rot somewhere on your property. Again, the fallen dead wood also is a huge important habitat for insects. So we're on to step 12. You have completed the 12-step program. So now you're in a maintenance phase, but no garden is ever done. You're now in where you're observing what's working, you're identifying new things that are popping up. I have many, many wildflower species that I did not buy. They arrived on their own. And they're things that I see in native plant nurseries that people spend good money on, but they just decided to volunteer on my property all on their own. So that's always great to have free plants, but it's important to be able to recognize them too and not pull them up. That's where all that identifying with your apps comes in. Notice what is working, what is spreading, what looks healthy, what is just not happy. Don't go with anything that's not happy. Build on successes. If you have some bee balm, some Monarda fistulosa that's spreading, help it along. Take up clumps, move it around to other places. If you have things that are too aggressive, too much goldenrod, maybe, you are free to pull it out if there's too much of it. You don't want it to take over. So as I said, you go with what works. It's wonderful to be sitting in your garden and see all these new critters that were not there before. I love using my iNaturalist app to identify all kinds of new insects that I didn't even know existed. So it is a ever evolving adventure and a lot of fun. So that is the end of my presentation. And if people have questions, I can answer their questions now.
Thank you so much, Heidi. This is Ambrose again. I am going to watch for anyone raising their hands. But I wanted to reiterate that Heidi is showing her email address on the screen, so you are welcome to send questions or requests for those links that Heidi
Sure.
mentioned.
Yep. To stop sharing.
Oh, there's
Oh, I
Melissa.
guess I should keep sharing. I just wanted to see all the participants, but my email address is hdollard@gmail.com, and feel free to send me any questions. And I see there are questions. Two people have questions.
Yeah, Melissa can go first, and then I
Okay.
can second.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi, Heidi. Thank you very
Hi.
much for this talk. It was so helpful. Lots of good information. I really appreciate it. I'm wondering a little bit about, you know, these are always variations and location and stuff. but a little bit about the leaves just settling, because I've read a bit about them kind of overlapping and depending, well, like oak leaves, for example, but other places too, where they overlap and they kind of block water infiltration and aeration of soil, etc., especially if it's had a bit of a rough time. So I get that. Sorry to go on so much. So I get that if we shred them, we're killing the insects, but that makes it more amenable to breaking down and feeding the soil.
Right.
And if we don't shred them, then we're not really, we're perhaps protecting the insects, but we're not allowing the infiltration so much.
No, it's not like oak leaves are going to prevent the soil underneath an oak tree from getting rainwater.
Oh, I was thinking more about the insects themselves, but okay.
No, oak leaf, no. A lot of people, it is true that oak leaves mat and oak leaves do not
Yeah.
break down as quickly. So you have to be a little bit more, I don't know, it's better to plant bigger, stronger plants under an oak trees that can really poke themselves through the leaf mat.
Okay,
Or
got
you
it.
can just in the spring, if you can, find where the plants are poking up, just gently spread the leaves apart so that the plants can come up.
Help
But
them out a bit.
yeah, give them, yeah, exactly. But no, oaks are by all the studies that Doug Tallamy has done. He wrote a whole book about oaks and how great they are. And it's partly because so many insects overwinter in those oak leaves.
Right. So how about
So
a maple, like kind of a regal maple that we might have on a property? And
that's the maple, but maple leaves just kind of crumble into dust before
uh,
before the winter's over. But yeah, I'm sure there's insects that like maple leaves too.
okay.
It's
Okay, so
it's
thanks.
just
So if we just
if they're
leave them,
native,
they'll do
they're good.
okay. We don't need,
Yeah, you don't have to worry about them.
we don't
No,
need to mow
yeah,
over them and shred them.
no,
Okay, that's
no,
interesting.
don't shred them. Don't.
That's good to
No,
know. Thank you.
no. So what were you going to ask, Vivian?
Oh, first of all, I want to thank you for such an informative presentation. It's a subject that I'm interested in, and I learned a lot from you.
Great.
So that's number one. And number two is, speaking of learning, I was just wondering, in your various outreach in the community, do you see any interest in schools or colleges or community colleges or private institutions to make some of these more pollinator-friendly measures a part of their landscaping?
Oh, there's quite a few elementary schools that have pollinator gardens. As a matter of fact, that first pollinator garden I was talking about it was full of the huge floppy plants.
Yeah.
A lot of those came from the Irving Elementary School. A lot of the original plants for that came from the Irving Elementary School. Belchertown, where I live, has it's primarily a vegetable garden, but they have a pollinator section. Yeah, it is tough because under our state rules around, teaching to the tests and so much, oversight of the curriculum, it's hard for a lot of teachers to fit this in, but it, yeah, I think there is a lot of interest in that. Well, did you see the biodiversity builders presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that was very encouraging. there is a lot of interest, but honestly, I think there needs to be way, way, way more. I mean, people just don't know anything about what's in their own backyards. They've no clue. I was doing a rare plant survey Tuesday, and of course, it was with a couple of other extreme plant nerds. And one of the women said that she had gone to a guy's yard. I can't remember what it was, but he had this huge swallowwort vine, and he was a gardener. And she said, that swallowwort, you're going to want, that's a terrible invasive. And he was like, really? I think it's beautiful. He didn't even know what an invasive plant was. Never mind that he had this enormous swallowwort vine on his property. And I just feel like children don't know where their food comes from. They don't know anything about the natural environment. It's unless their parents have really gone out of their way to send them to a nature camp or something. It's just not part of our culture, and it really needs to be. So yeah, it's there is a lot of interest, but not enough. It should be institutionalized. And probably a lot of teachers don't know anything either. That's the problem.
Thank you. Yes, we're trying to encourage that here in the public schools in our town, and there have been some steps, but it takes a lot more to really have it become part of the culture.
The other big problem is that children are taught to fear insects. It's like they see a bee go by and their mother goes, a bee. And then the kid is going to think, oh my God, I should be terrified of bees. And I don't, that whole cycle needs to be broken. I was working on a garden project last year, and it was supposed to be this community garden. And one of the mothers said, can you have a section where there's no flowers? Because my son is deathly afraid of bees. And luckily, it was passed on to us. So I couldn't speak to the mother directly because the look on my face would have given away what I was thinking. But it was like, plant a garden with no flowers so that we don't have any bees. So yeah, that's where a lot of parents are from. We have to protect our children from these scary insects instead of showing them how fascinating and in many cases exquisitely beautiful these insects are. I didn't talk much about moths, but that's moths are really much more important pollinators than butterflies are. And there's many more species of moths. And they are one of the categories of insects that are really, really harmed by night lights because they're attracted to our porch lights and everything. But boy, there are some of the moths, our native moths, are the most unbelievably gorgeous creatures on Earth. And, our children should be taught to appreciate this and seek out this incredible beauty. We're losing all of our fireflies now. How many children have been able to see a field full of flashing fireflies? It's just so sad to me. But I don't know if you have ever been on a pollinator safari with Nick Dorian, but he has these like vacuum guns that you can vacuum up an insect, and then they're held in a little chamber Well, I got one of those guns and they are so much fun. And I lend them out to any kid who's interested. And it's very, you know, you don't have to touch the insect, you just scoop it into this little chamber. And so you can look at it as long as you want, and then you let it go when you're done. No harm to the insect. And kids just love those. So I think that every school should be issued a set of these little vacuum guns so kids can go out and explore the insect world. I think that would help a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. We need
Thank you, Heidi.
we need kids to realize that not only is there a lot to learn, but our whole ecosystem depends upon various types of pollinators in order to survive. The forest
Yeah,
and that we like to hike in, or along different meadows or things like that. That's they will be gone without the pollinators, and where
our
will we
food.
be?
Yeah, our food will not be pollinated.
That's right.
There are places,
Vegetables, a lot of vegetables and fruits.
right? There's places in China that have had so much pesticides applied that there's no more bees, and that the pear trees and maybe some other fruit species have to be pollinated by hand. People are hired to climb up in trees with a paintbrush and move the pollen from flower to flower. And there are some labs that are anticipating the the lack of pollinating bees, and they're trying to invent drones that will pollinate all these crops. You know, how how expensive do you think a pear or an apple will be that has been hand pollinated? People won't be able to afford fruit if there's, before the fruit trees just, you know, disappear, really. It's just terrifying to think of the direction we're headed in here.
Well, it's getting to the end of your
Yes, I'm sure it
presentation
is.
time.
Yeah, I
Beyond.
think this is a great time to wrap up. Yeah, because we've had a really lovely evening, and I think the focus on your backyard, your environment, what you can do in your small local area is where we have the most power at this point in time for most
Yeah.
of us. So,
Oh,
thank
absolutely.
you. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Heidi. And
Thank you all
I
to everybody in Great Barrington for hosting me. It was a pleasure.
absolutely. Oh, Melissa, sorry, I'm gonna let you say something else.
Just saying thank you. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Oh, very helpful. Been
Thanks
working,
for coming.
been digging and trying to find this information, and it's extremely helpful to have it in such a succinct manner. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you
Excellent.
all. Have a good evening.